Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind picked up just as the sun slipped behind the distant ridgeline, setting the sky ablaze with oranges and dusky pinks. Eleanor Pierce stood beside her rental car, arms crossed against the sudden chill of a Montana twilight. Dust swirled at her boots, boots far too new and far too clean to belong here. The GPS had long since given up. Her phone was out of signal. Her heart, once fueled by ambition and boardroom battles, now pulsed with the ragged rhythm of someone who wasn't sure what came next. She was supposed to be in Zurich tonight, shaking hands with global investors, finalizing a merger between Pierce Innovations and a data mining giant she neither trusted nor respected. Instead, she was here, off the grid, off script, and more lost than her staff would believe possible. A distant engine hummed. Eleanor turned, squinting into the golden haze. A beat-up Ford truck crested the hill, its headlights flickering in the dust. It slowed as it neared, then came to a stop beside her. "Evening, Nan," the man said as he stepped out. He looked to be in his late 40s, lean and sun-worn, with eyes the color of worn denim, and a quiet steadiness that didn't come from any conference room. "Car trouble?" he asked. "I think I took a wrong turn," Eleanor replied, voice more steady than she felt. "And now I'm a little stuck." He looked at the rental, its front tire buried in soft gravel, and nodded. "That road washes out after a storm." "You're not the first to find yourself in a bind out here." He offered a hand. "Name's Daniel. I've got a chain in the truck. Let's get you back on solid ground." She hesitated only a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, not forceful, reassuring, safe. Within minutes he had the car unhitched and idling properly on the packed gravel. "Where were you headed?" Eleanor glanced toward the horizon. "I'm not sure anymore." Daniel gave her a sidelong look, then offered the faintest smile. "Well, Willow Ridge Farm's just down the road. It's not much, but it's warm, and you can get your bearings, unless you'd rather keep wandering under the stars." She hesitated, the part of her trained to say no, to keep walls high and interactions brief, ready to decline. But another part, quieter and tired of pretending, nodded instead. "I'd appreciate that." The farmhouse sat like a relic from another century. White clapboard siding, wide porch, and a single light glowing from the kitchen window. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. A kettle sang softly on the stove. A dog, large, old, and grizzled, thumped his tail from a worn rug in the corner. "Rusty's old bark," Daniel said, hanging his coat, "but he'll watch you like a hawk till he decides you're one of us." Eleanor ran a hand along the back of a weathered kitchen chair. Everything in the room spoke of long hours, hard work, and love worn into wood and fabric. "Sandwich," Daniel said, setting a chipped mug in front of her. "You look like you could use something warm." She took a sip, surprised by how much the tea calmed her. "Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt your evening." "You didn't," he said simply. "Not much company around these parts." Not much company around these parts." "You're welcome to stay the night if you need. Guest rooms clean, no questions asked." Eleanor looked at him, wondering if he had any idea who she really was. But his eyes held no flicker of recognition. It was oddly liberating. "I think I will," she said. The days that followed passed in slow, unexpected rhythms. Eleanor woke to birds' song, not alarms. She chopped vegetables beside Daniel in the kitchen, her designer hands clumsy but learning. She walked the fence lines with him in the early morning chill, her breath clouding as he explained which trees fed the bees and which ones signaled water below the surface. She asked questions, not to gain an advantage, but because she was truly curious. He answered with patient simplicity, never once making her feel foolish. He didn't pry. And she didn't volunteer the truth. Not yet. Each evening they sat on the porch, watching the sun fade behind the cottonwoods. They spoke of small things, of crops and weather, of music and memories, never of mergers, never of stock valuations. And yet a bond grew, something quiet, something steady, like roots taking hold. On the fifth night, a storm rolled in. Lightning danced over the ridges, and thunder shook the old house. Eleanor stood by the window, the wind tangling her hair. "I should go," she said suddenly, turning to Daniel. "I've stayed too long. I'm not. This isn't who I am." Daniel didn't flinch. "Then who are you?" She hesitated. The moment hung, crackling with tension. "My name is Eleanor Pierce." He blinked, recognizing it at last. "I run a tech firm, one of the biggest in the country. I've been on the covers of magazines you've probably never read. I left it all behind last week, walked out before a deal that would have made my company even bigger. They think I've lost my mind." She looked at him, waiting for anger, for disbelief, for the cold shift that always came when someone learned the full weight of her name. But Daniel only nodded slowly. "That sounds exhausting." It wasn't the response she expected. It wasn't the response she expected. It was better. "You lied," he added gently. "But you didn't come here to hurt anyone. That counts for something." "I just wanted something real," she whispered. "And then I found this place, found you." He stepped closer, the storm fading behind them into soft rain. Then, "Stay. If it's real you're after, you've found it. But peace never stays untested." 2 days later, Daniel received notice that the adjacent farmland, once belonging to the Myers family, was sold to a development group. Luxury homes, resort amenities, the kind of venture that would drain the water tables and inflate taxes until small farms like his couldn't hold on. "What if I could help?" Eleanor asked that night, seated beside the fire. Daniel looked at her warily. "I know people, and I know how to make things move," quietly. He stood slowly. "No. I won't be anyone's cause. I've fought too long to keep this land out of others' hands." "I'm not trying to buy it," she said softly. "I'm trying to protect it." "I need to think," he replied, and left her alone with the firelight. The next morning, she was gone. No note, just an envelope left on the table with one word: "Soon." 2 weeks passed. Daniel tried to push her from his thoughts, but her presence clung like her scent in the guest room. Lavender and something electric. Then came the call from the county office. The Myers property had been quietly donated to a local preservation trust. Development cancelled, water rights restored. The trust's anonymous benefactor? Unconfirmed. But Daniel didn't need confirmation. He stood on the porch that night, the wind moving through the cottonwoods like a whispered promise. Eleanor returned in spring. Her car pulled up the drive just as the apple trees began to bloom. She stepped out, not in heels or silk, but in jeans worn honest with work. A canvas bag slung over one shoulder. "I'm not here to fix anything," she said before he could speak. "Just to ask if there's room for me." Daniel took in the sight of her, sunlight dancing in her hair, something hopeful and hesitant in her eyes. "There's always been room," he said. "You just had to want it." That evening they sat on the porch again, 2 mugs between them, silence soft as dusk. Above them a sky stretched vast and unbothered, the future unwritten. Beside them the cottonwoods swayed, and between them something real grew stronger with every breath. The early morning air carried a chill, the kind that whispered of changing seasons. Mist hovered over the grass at Willow Ridge Farm, and Eleanor Pierce, former tech mogul, current mystery guest, stood on the porch with a chipped ceramic mug warming her hands. The sky stretched wide and pale above her, streaked with lavender and rose as the sun struggled to rise. She had spent 2 weeks now at Daniel Whitaker's farm, and not a single day had passed without her thinking about leaving, and then quietly deciding to stay. Daniel, with his quiet integrity and sun-browned skin, had never pressed her for details. Not when her phone never rang. Not when she paused too long at the sight of his battered ledger full of handwritten numbers. And certainly not when she'd shown an uncanny ability to repair the irrigation control box using little more than a multi-tool and electrical tape. But Eleanor saw it in his eyes sometimes. A flicker of curiosity. A question unasked. This morning, she pulled on her boots. Real leather now worn in with actual dirt, not the fashionably distressed kind from Manhattan boutiques, and walked out to meet him in the barn. Daniel was already there, mucking stalls with the kind of dedication that didn't need applause. When he glanced up, a faint smile curved the corners of his mouth. "Farm doesn't wait on sleep, neither does New York," she replied, then winced slightly. She had been careful not to mention her past, but Daniel only nodded and handed her a pitchfork. "No matter where you are, the day has a rhythm. Just depends on whether you're listening to the land or the clock." That day, like so many before, passed in quiet partnership. They fed the livestock, checked fences, planted late summer vegetables in a field freshly turned. The rhythm of manual labor was nothing like boardroom negotiations, but in some strange, honest way, it was exactly what Eleanor's soul had hungered for. At lunchtime they sat on the back steps and shared egg salad sandwiches and thermoses of sweet tea. Daniel pulled a notebook from his pocket and started listing what still needed fixing before winter. His handwriting was blocky, confident. She found herself watching the way his thumb tapped rhythmically as he thought, like a man steady enough to build a life with, if life hadn't already taught her not to trust easy. He glanced at her. "You're good at keeping up?" he said simply. "You're good at keeping up," he said simply. Not many folks would dive into this life head first. "I think I needed something real," she answered without thinking. "You find it here?" "I think I'm starting to." That evening, as they shelled beans together under the porch light, Eleanor told him about the time she'd climbed the fire escape to her own office building just to breathe without a schedule, just to remind herself the sky exists. Daniel listened without comment, but when he went inside and returned with a wool blanket, he draped it around her shoulders without a word. A simple act, a gesture of care, but it nearly undid her. Sunday came, bringing with it the soft hymns of wind and a rare quiet. Eleanor wandered through the old orchard, behind the farmhouse, where crooked trees still bore fruit despite decades of storms and droughts. There she found a swing, weathered and swaying slightly. She sat, let the creak of rope and breeze soothe her, and thought about all she hadn't told him, about Pierce Innovations, about the press releases she had never issued, about the merger her board still hoped to force. She closed her eyes. You can't hide forever, Eleanor. But something in her wasn't ready to break the silence just yet. Later that afternoon, Daniel found her trimming mint by the garden fence. "You ever drive a tractor?" Eleanor laughed. "Is that a serious question?" "Well, there's a first time for everything." And so, hands trembling slightly, she climbed into the cab beside him. His arm brushed hers as he guided her through the motions, and her heart jumped in a way no shareholder meeting had ever inspired. They laughed when she stalled it, twice, but by the end of the day she'd pulled her weight in the Northfield, and Daniel looked at her like someone who belonged. That night, thunder rolled in low and slow. Rain followed, soft at first, then heavy, drumming against the farmhouse roof. In the dark, Eleanor stood at the window in Daniel's guest room, watching lightning-etched silver lines across the horizon. A knock came at her door. "You okay? Okay," Daniel asked, voice low. She nodded, just thinking. Storms make that easy. He lingered in the hallway. She turned. "Thank you for not asking questions I'm not ready to answer. I figure if a story is worth telling, it'll come in time." Eleanor nodded. "It's not a story I'm proud of. Most of us have those," Daniel said. "The good ones still lead us somewhere better." He turned to go, then hesitated. "If the storm wakes you, there's coffee by the stove. I'll be up at dawn." She smiled, heart aching with gratitude. "Good night, Daniel." But the storm wasn't done. By morning, the eastern fence had fallen. A large branch had crushed part of the chicken coop roof, and Eleanor, to her own surprise, threw on boots and gloves and helped patch things up, rain and all. They worked silently for hours, soaked but smiling. When it was done, and the coop held firm again, Daniel poured them both black coffee into mismatched mugs and said, "You ever think about staying longer?" Eleanor paused, fingers wrapped tight around the warm ceramic. "Every day," she whispered. He nodded, accepting her truth without demand. "That's enough for now." Weeks passed. The garden thrived. So did Eleanor. One afternoon, as they harvested squash together, Daniel turned to her, voice casual. "Fall festival's in 2 weeks. Town puts on a pie contest. I usually bring apple." She tilted her head. "You make pies, sort of. I help Mrs. Grantham peel apples, and she does the magic. But maybe this year you and I could make one." Eleanor laughed. "Are you asking me to enter a pie contest with you?" He shrugged, but there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. A tentative hope. "It's not exactly the Met Gala, but around here it means something." She smiled, soft and wide. "Then I'd be honored." That night she stood on the back porch again, watching the stars blink into being over Willow Ridge. Her fingers brushed her phone. Silent, hidden in her suitcase, untouched since the day she arrived. She could end it all. One call, one email, or she could stay in this silence a little longer. Some truths took time. Some truths needed roots. She looked toward the barn where Daniel's old dog slept, toward the field they'd walked at sunset. And she thought, maybe I wasn't just running, maybe I was searching, and maybe she was almost home. The storm rolled in just past midnight, sweeping across Willow Ridge like an untamed memory. Lightning danced above the ridgeline, casting stark shadows on the farmhouse walls. Inside, the air was thick with silence, words unspoken, truths unveiled. Eleanor Pierce sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea she hadn't touched. Her fingers trembled, though not from the chill of the evening. Across from her sat Lena Whitaker, Daniel's daughter, her jaw clenched, eyes flashing with betrayal. "I looked you up," Lena said quietly, the hurt in her voice sharper than any thunderclap. "You're not Eleanor White, the stranded traveler." You're not Eleanor... You're Eleanor Pierce, the Eleanor Pierce, CEO of Altura Technologies. Billionaire. The woman behind that merger my father's been railing against for months. Eleanor closed her eyes, shame swelling inside her like floodwater. "Lena, I never meant to lie," Lena cut in. "Because you did. Every day you smiled at us, helped in the fields, laughed at our kitchen table. Every day you pretended. The thunder cracked again, as if nature itself punctuated the accusation. I was going to tell him, Eleanor said, voice barely above a whisper. I just didn't know how. Not after everything I'd seen here. After how much he came to mean to me. Did he mean more than your empire? Lena asked. Or was he just a rural curiosity? A break from the boardroom grind? No. The answer came fast and full, the only solid thing Eleanor had left to offer. Daniel showed me something I didn't know I needed. Peace, purpose, truth. I came here running from a life that had nothing real left in it. I didn't expect to find someone so grounded, so honest. I didn't expect to fall in love. Lena stood, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You should leave. You should leave. Before he comes back from town, spare him the final blow. Eleanor looked down at her hands. And if I want to stay and face it, face him? Lena hesitated. Then be ready, because he doesn't take betrayal lightly. The sun had not yet broken the horizon when Daniel returned. The truck tires crunched over gravel, headlights sweeping across the barn Eleanor had helped paint just weeks before. She stepped onto the porch, the weight of sleeplessness and dread pressing down on her shoulders. Daniel climbed out of the truck slowly, his movements wary. He looked older in the pale dawn light, like someone who'd lost something irreplaceable. I suppose Lena told you, Eleanor said softly. She did. Silence stretched between them, fragile and sharp. I never meant to lie, Eleanor began. I never planned to stay. I didn't think I'd find anything here. Well, but I met you, and Lena, and the animals, the soil. I found something real for the first time in years. I was scared to lose it. You still lied, Daniel said. His voice was calm, but the tremble beneath it betrayed the storm within. Day after day you let me believe you were someone else. I opened my life to you. My family, I know, and I'll never stop regretting that, she said. But everything I did here, every moment I spent with you, it was real. Daniel looked out across the fields. The merger, that company, it's everything I stand against. I know, she said. That's why I walked away. He turned to her, surprised. What? I left it. I resigned from Altura. I handed in my shares, my board seat, all of it. Daniel blinked. Why? Because none of it mattered anymore, Eleanor said. Not after this place, not after you. The morning wind stirred the tall grass beyond the fence line. For a long time, Daniel said nothing. Then finally, his voice cracked the quiet. You gave up billions for me. No, Eleanor said. I gave it up for myself, but I stayed because of you. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a CEO or a runaway, but as a woman willing to risk everything for truth. I don't know if I can just forgive this, he said. I don't expect you to, Eleanor replied. But if there's even a chance, I'll stay. I'll work for it, day by day, chore by chore. A long breath escaped him. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, weathered, familiar. His late wife's locket. She gave me this on our first spring together, he said. Told me love's not just about the good days. It's how you walk together through the storms. He handed it to Eleanor. I don't know what we are now. I don't know what we are now. But I'd like to walk a little farther with you. See where it leads. Tears welled in her eyes as she accepted the locket with trembling fingers. Then I'll walk beside you, she whispered. Then I'll walk beside you, she whispered. That morning Eleanor stayed, not as a guest, not as a CEO, but as someone rebuilding, step by step. She joined Lena to muck the stables, helped Daniel mend a fence blown down in the storm. Neighbors came by whispering about headlines, about rumors. Eleanor didn't hide. She looked them in the eye, shook their hands, and asked what needed doing. Day after day, she showed up. She taught Lena how to build a greenhouse irrigation app using open-source software. She started volunteering at the local school, bringing laptops and coding lessons, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as Eleanor, the woman who now lived in the guest room at Willow Ridge Farm. Slowly, trust returned. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. And one golden evening, as wildflowers swayed along the fence, and Daniel grilled steaks over a fire pit they'd built together, he turned to her and said, simply, "You stayed." "You stayed?" She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wasn't finished learning how to love the right way." They ate under the stars, laughter mingling with the sounds of the land of home. A place where storms passed, but roots held fast, where hearts could be mended, not by grand gestures, but by truth, persistence, and time. And in the distance, the old barn stood steady beneath the moonlight, as if to say, "Healing happens here. Welcome home." The rain had passed, leaving behind a hush that blanketed Willow Ridge like a fresh start. The fields sparkled with lingering dew, the soil dark and generous beneath Eleanor's boots. She stood at the edge of the pasture fence, watching the cows move lazily through the damp grass. Behind her, the barn creaked in the gentle wind, carrying with it the scent of hay and wood smoke and something older, something like belonging. Daniel hadn't spoken much since the storm. He didn't ask her to leave. That alone was more grace than Eleanor felt she deserved. But he didn't linger near her any more either. Meals were shared in a companionable, aching silence. Their once effortless conversation, laced with shared stories and mismatched humor, had faded like fog in morning sun. Eleanor accepted it. There was no grand apology that could fix what she'd done. Only time and effort, and the hope that her presence might still mean something, even now that the truth had stripped away the fantasy. She rose before dawn each morning, long before Daniel, or even Lena stirred. The farmhouse kitchen had become her sanctuary, where she baked sourdough loaves from the starter tucked away in the fridge, where she experimented with wildflower teas and tinkered with preserves using Daniel's late wife's handwritten recipes. She never altered the original notes, just added her own in pencil, like whispers rather than declarations. Sometimes Lena would enter the kitchen to find fresh biscuits, still warm, covered with a linen cloth. She never said thank you, but she always took one. Small progress. Out in the fields, Eleanor's muscles began to remember the rhythm of rural labor, mending fences, cleaning coops. She taught herself to drive the old tractor, not gracefully, not without stalling it at least twice every time, but Daniel never corrected her. She noticed he still carried his father's old pocket knife in his back pocket, and one day she left a new whetstone by the barn workbench with a simple note. "For the edge that keeps cutting true." He didn't say anything, but the knife gleamed sharper the next morning. One night, well past dusk, Eleanor found Daniel on the porch, sipping from the same chipped mug he used every morning since she arrived. "Coffee this late?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He shrugged, then gestured to the empty chair beside him. They sat without words, just crickets and the occasional lowing from the barn. "I lied to you," she said finally. "You did. You did. Still here." He looked at her, eyes shadowed but not cold. "I noticed." Eleanor swallowed hard. I didn't stay because I was trying to fix my image or salvage some corporate angle. I stayed because, for the first time, I liked who I was when no one expected anything from me." He nodded slowly. "I liked her too. Still trying to figure out if she's real." A pause, heavy and intimate. "Daniel," she whispered, "I'd rather be real and flawed than polished and gone." He exhaled, a long, low sound. "Then let's see who sticks around." Summer shifted into late July. The Harvest Fair Committee, run by a trio of no-nonsense ladies in the town hall basement, approached Daniel about running the Ridge booth again. He hesitated, then turned to Eleanor. "You any good at peach preserves?" "I've been studying," she said, lifting her chin. "Then we've got a shot." They worked side by side for days. He showed her how to select the right peaches, not too soft, not too green. She taught him how to design a booth display that would catch the eye, even under a crooked canvas tent. Lena helped too, grudgingly at first, but more openly by the time Eleanor shared her secret apple pie spice mix. The fair brought more than ribbons and foot traffic. Word had spread about that fancy tech woman living at Willow Ridge. Some locals came just to gawk. Others came curious, hoping she might invest in their ventures or help them modernize. Eleanor listened politely, but always turned the conversation back to seeds, soil, or slow food. That earned her more respect than if she'd handed out checks. At the end of the fair, their booth won second prize for Best Heritage Display. Daniel didn't smile, not quite, but he didn't stop Eleanor from framing the ribbon either. On a late August morning, Eleanor stood in the barn brushing Daisy, the mare with the white blaze and stubborn temperament. Daniel leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, watching her. "She likes you," he said. "Got something I want to show you," he said after a beat. He led her to the north field, where an old tool shed stood mostly forgotten. Inside, beneath a tarp, was a contraption of gears and iron and ware-polished wood. "My grandfather's seed spreader," he said. "Been trying to fix it for years." Eleanor knelt beside it, running her fingers over the mechanisms. "I could help," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that." They worked through the afternoon. Grease on hands, laughter between tasks, and for the first time since everything had come undone, Daniel reached over without thinking and brushed a strand of hair from Eleanor's face. Neither of them mentioned it, but the touch lingered long after the sun slipped behind the ridge. One night, after Lena had gone to bed and the crickets had taken up their symphony, Daniel found Eleanor standing under the stars. "You miss your old life?" he asked. She tilted her head, thinking. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but mostly I miss the illusion of control. Out here, I've learned to let go." He nodded. "Land teaches you that. You work, you wait, you trust." They stood quietly. The scent of lavender drifted from the field. Somewhere an owl hooted. "I trust you, Eleanor," he said finally. Her heart caught. "I know it'll take time," he continued, "but if you're willing to keep showing up, keep being who you've been these past few weeks, maybe there's more than just forgiveness waiting." Eleanor reached for his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." And so the mending continued. Not dramatic, not always visible, but steady, like a seed beneath the soil, reaching for light. Lena began leaving Eleanor small notes, recipes clipped from magazines, scribbled instructions for garden compost ratios. Nothing sentimental, but they meant everything. Daniel invited Eleanor to help lead the fall planting workshop at the community center. She wore her boots, not heels. She brought notebooks, not PowerPoints. No one called her CEO. They called her neighbor, friend. One night, as the first frost kissed the fields, Eleanor stood by the porch, watching her breath curl in the cold air. Daniel stepped beside her, holding 2 mugs of cider. "You remember the night it stormed? You remember the night it stormed?" he asked. "I'll never forget it. I remember thinking," he said, "that everything I'd worked for might be slipping away. That letting someone in like that could cost me too much." Eleanor looked at him, heart suddenly aching. Heart suddenly aching. Heart suddenly aching. "I'm glad I was wrong," he said. And in the hush that followed, Eleanor leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. That winter, the North Field saw its first full planting in years. The seed spreader worked like a charm. Eleanor added her own notes to its repair journal. Signed simply, EP, in Daniel's study. A photo appeared. Eleanor in coveralls, dirt on her nose, holding a basket of kale like a prize. Below it, written in Daniel's tidy hand, "Growth looks different on everyone." Time passed. Trust deepened, and though Eleanor still hadn't unpacked her designer suits or answered her old board's emails, she knew something with certainty. This life, this land, wasn't her fallback. It was her future. The crisp autumn air carried a scent of change as Eleanor Pierce stood at the edge of Willow Ridge Farm, gazing over the rolling fields she had come to cherish. The golden hues of harvested wheat stretched toward the horizon, a testament to the land's generosity and the community's toil. Yet, beneath this serene landscape, an undercurrent of unease stirred. A storm not of nature, but of human desire. The tranquility Eleanor had found in the rhythms of farm life was disrupted one evening when Daniel Whitaker approached her, a letter clutched tightly in his weathered hand. His eyes, usually calm and steady, flickered with concern. "This came today," he said, handing her the envelope. Eleanor unfolded the letter, her heart sinking as she read. It was an official notice from Pierce Holdings, her family's conglomerate, announcing their intent to purchase farmland in the Willow Ridge area for development purposes. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Her father, Richard Pierce. Her past had caught up with her. The next morning, Eleanor sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table. The letter between them. The early sunlight cast long shadows, mirroring the weight of their conversation. "I never thought they'd come here," Eleanor admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "After I left, I assumed they'd focus elsewhere." Daniel's gaze was steady, but filled with unspoken questions. "What does this mean for us? For the community?" Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "My father and brother are relentless when it comes to expansion. If they've set their sights on Willow Ridge, they'll stop at nothing to acquire the land. Their typical approach involves buying out farmers, often at prices hard to refuse, and transforming the area into something unrecognizable. Luxury resorts, gated communities." Daniel's jaw tightened. "This land isn't just property. It's our home, our livelihood. We've seen what happens when developers move in. Communities are displaced, traditions lost." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand covering his. "I won't let that happen here. We'll fight this together." Determined to confront her family's ambitions, Eleanor arranged a meeting with her father and brother in the nearby town of Livingston. The chosen venue was a stark contrast to the opulent boardrooms she was once accustomed to. A modest cafe with a scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of homemade pastries. Richard Pierce arrived first, his presence commanding as always. Despite his age, he exuded an air of authority that had intimidated many. Following closely was her brother, Jonathan, whose sharp eyes mirrored their father's ambition. "Eleanor," Richard greeted, his tone neutral but laced with underlying tension. "It's been a while." She nodded, her posture straight, embodying the resilience she had cultivated since leaving the corporate world. "Father, Jonathan? Jonathan smirked. You've certainly chosen an unconventional path. Eleanor ignored the jab, focusing on the matter at hand. I received your letter about the development plans for Willow Ridge. I'm here to ask you to reconsider. Richard's expression remained impassive. It's a strategic move, Eleanor. The area's potential is vast, and the returns substantial. You, of all people, should understand that. I understand the value of the land, she countered, but I also understand the value of the community that thrives there. Your plans would dismantle a way of life that has existed for generations. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. It's business. Progress requires change. Not all change is progress, Eleanor shot back. These are people's lives, their homes. Displacing them for profit is not justifiable. Richard sighed, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. What would you have us do? Abandon a lucrative opportunity because of sentimentality? Yes, Eleanor said firmly. Because it's the right thing to do. A tense silence settled over the table. Finally, Richard spoke, his tone softer but resolute. I'll consider your perspective, Eleanor, but I make no promises. Days turned into weeks, and the threat of development loomed over Willow Ridge like a dark cloud. Eleanor immersed herself in community meetings, rallying the farmers and residents to stand against the impending takeover. They formed coalitions, sought legal counsel, and reached out to local media to shed light on their plight. The community's unity was palpable. Neighbors who once worked their fields in solitude now gathered to strategize and support one another. Stories of ancestral ties to the land were shared, strengthening their collective resolve. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the fields, Daniel found Eleanor sitting on the porch, exhaustion evident in her posture. "You've done so much," he said, sitting beside her. "But this fight is taking its toll on you." She offered a weary smile. "It's worth it. This place, these people, they've given me more than I could have ever imagined. I can't let them down." Daniel took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You're not alone in this. We all stand with you." The turning point came unexpectedly. An investigative journalist from a regional newspaper uncovered questionable practices by Pierce Holdings in previous developments, instances of environmental negligence, and coercive tactics used against landowners. The exposé sent ripples through the media, tarnishing the company's reputation. Facing public backlash and potential legal ramifications, Richard Pierce announced a halt to the Willow Ridge project. The community celebration was heartfelt but tempered with caution. They had won this battle, but the war against unchecked development was ongoing. In the aftermath, Eleanor stood with Daniel atop a gentle hill overlooking the farm. The land stretched before them, resilient and enduring. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, emotion thick in her voice. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "For what? For standing by me, for believing in this fight." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "This land, this community, they're worth fighting for. And so are you." As the stars emerged, blanketing the sky in a tapestry of light, Eleanor felt a profound sense of belonging. She had faced her past, stood firm against formidable odds, and found a home not just in a place, but in the hearts of those who had embraced her. The battle for Willow Ridge had tested their strength, but it had also solidified the bonds that made them unbreakable. The wind had shifted in Willow Ridge. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't laced with tension or dread. Instead, it carried the scent of fresh hay, turned soil, and something quieter. Hope. Eleanor Pierce stood at the edge of Daniel Whitaker's fields, her boots now properly scuffed, her hands speckled with dirt. The town hall meeting still echoed in her bones. her voice ringing out as she publicly denounced Whitmore Holdings, her father's empire. She'd forfeited stock options, board seats, and perhaps every last ounce of familial grace she'd ever had, but she'd never felt lighter. Daniel was already out in the pasture, coaxing a reluctant calf back to its mother. She watched him from the distance. Steady, grounded. He hadn't said much since the meeting. A nod, a quiet thank you. But then again, Daniel was a man of action, not applause. Eleanor stepped over the fence, her fingers trailing the weathered wood. It felt like crossing into something sacred, as though each splinter was a boundary marker between who she had been and who she had been. "Morning," she called softly. Daniel glanced back, shielding his eyes from the morning sun. "He's stubborn," he said, nodding toward the calf. "Wants independence but doesn't quite know what to do with it." She smiled. "Sounds familiar." They worked in silence for a while, guiding the calf, repairing a section of broken fence, checking the irrigation pumps she'd helped upgrade. Every shared task felt like a sentence in a story they were writing together, slowly, carefully. "You meant what you said?" Daniel finally asked, straightening. Eleanor paused. "Every word. I didn't come here planning to change my life, but the people, the land, you, it changed me." Daniel's gaze softened. "You just talk, Eleanor." "You stayed. You worked beside us. That means more than speeches." They walked back to the barn together, a soft rustle of leaves above their heads. Inside, Lena was brushing down Tansy, the old mare, while humming an old Patsy Cline tune. She looked up when she saw them, her expression guarded but not cold. "Coffee's on the stove," she said, as much to Eleanor as to her father. Eleanor took it as the truce it was. By mid-afternoon, word had spread that Eleanor's family had withdrawn 2 pending property purchases. No explanation given, no press statement. But folks around Willow Ridge weren't stupid. They knew whose hand had stayed the sword. Still, there was damage to undo. At the general store, Mrs. Dobbins took Eleanor's payment without comment, but her eyes lingered longer than usual. At the bakery, Tom Raid offered a dry morning, but didn't include her usual lemon scone. Daniel noticed. "They'll come around," he said as they loaded the truck. "They should be wary," Eleanor replied. "I was part of the problem." Daniel closed the tailgate gently. "You were, but now you're part of the solution." That evening, the town gathered again, not for a meeting, but a potluck. Under strings of lights, families filled picnic tables in the churchyard. Dishes appeared like magic. Green bean casserole, buttermilk biscuits, venison stew. Someone brought a radio, and country music crackled softly into the dusk. Eleanor lingered at the edge, unsure. Then Lena approached, holding out a plate. "Mom used to make this. It's not as good, but you should try it." Eleanor accepted the macaroni pie with shaking hands. "Thank you, Lena. You love my dad." It wasn't an accusation, just a question, simple and clear. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Yes, then don't give up." Eleanor looked across the yard at Daniel, who stood with a group of old-timers, a rare smile pulling at his face. She nodded. "I want." Later, as the stars scattered across the sky, Daniel and Eleanor found themselves alone at the edge of the cornfield. The night was thick with the scent of lilacs and warm earth. He held something in his hand, small, aged. "I've been holding on to this," he said, revealing a silver ring. "It was my mother's. My father gave it to her after the first harvest they survived together." Eleanor's breath caught. The band was worn smooth by decades of love and labor. "I'm not asking anything yet," Daniel continued. I wanted you to know I'm thinking about tomorrow. With you." She reached out, curling her fingers around his. "I'm thinking about tomorrow, too." In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm emerged in Willow Ridge. Eleanor used her savings, not from Montgomery Tech, but a personal trust she'd quietly maintained, to buy back 2 parcels of land her father had tried to claim. She transferred ownership to the town, held in trust for future generations. With Lena and a few local students, Eleanor began converting the old schoolhouse into a co-op learning center. Agricultural classes, renewable energy education, small business mentoring. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, adapted too. He installed drip irrigation lines Eleanor had designed, experimented with heirloom seeds she sourced from a nonprofit in Oregon, and even downloaded a farm management app, though he still insisted on recording everything in his old leather-bound logbook. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a day, but it grew. In potluck dinners, in co-op meetings, in the way Eleanor helped Mrs. Dobbins load feed bags without flinching, in the way Lena let Eleanor braid her hair before the harvest dance, and in the way Daniel began setting 2 coffee mugs on the porch swing. Every morning, autumn came with gold-leafed trees and the sweet smoke of harvest bonfires. One morning, Eleanor stood beside Daniel at the edge of the property, the mist curling around their boots. Below them, the valley stretched out, alive, enduring. "They offered again," she said softly. "A position, CEO of a sister company, New York." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And I told them no. Told them I was already working on the most important project of my life." He turned to her, something flickering in his eyes. "What's that?" She smiled. "Building a life, right here, right here." He exhaled slowly, then reached into his pocket. This time, he wasn't holding the ring, just his hand, open, waiting. Eleanor slid hers into his. "Come on," she said, her voice warm. "The goats want feed themselves." Together, they walked down the hill, toward the barn, toward breakfast, toward whatever came next. And far behind them, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying no secrets, only the sound of love taking root, deeper than anything Eleanor Pierce had ever known. The first snow came quietly, like a secret whispered across the valley. Eleanor stood on the porch of Willow Ridge Farm, wrapped in a flannel coat that still smelled faintly of hay and Daniel's aftershave. Snowflakes danced down from a pearly sky, settling over the rooflines and fence posts like forgiveness. In the hush of that early December morning, the world felt new, not in the way of inventions or patents, but in the way hearts sometimes do after long healing. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Daniel stepped out, 2 mugs in hand, steam curling like breath between them. "Still think Montana's too quiet," he teased, passing her the mug. Eleanor smiled, cradling the warmth. "It's the quiet that taught me how to listen again." Daniel didn't reply, but his hand slid over hers. That was how it was with them now. Less need for words, more room for understanding. After months of hard labor, public reckonings, and long talks over homemade soup, something sacred had begun to take root between them. Eleanor hadn't asked for forgiveness. She'd earned it. And Daniel, stubborn, salt-of-the-earth Daniel, had opened his heart in slow, cautious increments until one evening, while mending a broken fence post, had looked up and simply said, "You belong here." She hadn't cried then, but she did later, in the privacy of her room, tucked beneath quilts that smelled like cedar and lavender, whispering a thank you to the heavens for second chances. The days shortened and deepened. Together, they winterized the greenhouses, stockpiled feed, and taught workshops on sustainable irrigation methods. Eleanor's influence was no longer a secret. Shed stood at that town hall, declared her truth, and watched the townsfolk, one by one, nod their acceptance. What surprised her most wasn't the resistance, but the welcome. Lena, Daniel's daughter, had taken the longest to thaw, but even she had come around, especially after Eleanor helped her set up an online storefront for the family's heirloom seed line, complete with handwritten stories about each strain's history. "I didn't think anyone cared about this stuff anymore," Lena had whispered one evening as they labeled envelopes by candlelight. "They will now," Eleanor had replied, touching the younger woman's hand with the kind of care that only comes from having once been lost. By January, the rhythm of life was no longer something Eleanor mimicked. It was something she inhabited. She helped birth a breech calf under a frozen moon, her hands steady, her voice calm. She skinned her first deer and cried over it afterward, not out of revulsion, but respect. She learned that a successful winter garden required patience, trust in dormant things, and good compost. Daniel noticed not just her skill, but the softness that had returned to her eyes. "You're not the woman who showed up on my road last spring," he said one evening as they shared stew in front of the fire. "I'm more her now than I was then," she said. "I just didn't know it." He reached over, brushing a bit of flour from her cheek. "Good, because I kind of like this version. The night of the harvest solstice. The entire town gathered in the old Grange hall. It was Eleanor's idea, though she made sure the credit went elsewhere. Candles flickered in mason jars. Kids sang folk songs. And Miss Adeline made her famous mulled cider that tasted like nostalgia. Daniel watched Eleanor from across the room as she laughed with Lena, her head tilted back, her cheeks flushed. She wore an old sweater she'd mended herself, and around her neck hung a simple pendant, an acorn carved from last year's walnut harvest. He didn't remember walking toward her, only arriving, heart beating like hooves on frozen earth. "You're something else," he said, his voice a soft rasp. Eleanor looked at him. Really looked. So many things passed in that glance. Loss, healing, longing, hope. "I was waiting for someone to see me that way," she said. Daniel took her hand. "Come with me." They stepped outside into the snow-silent evening, the stars sharp and bright overhead. By the old oak near the Grange he stopped and turned. In his hand he held something small and smooth. A ring? Not new, not flashy, but etched with wheat stalks, its gold warmed by time. "This was my mother's," Daniel said, voice catching. "She always said a strong woman makes a strong home, no matter where she comes from." He paused. "You've made this home again, Eleanor." "Not just the house, but the land, the rhythm." "Me?" Eleanor's eyes filled. She reached for his weathered hand. "You don't have to ask," she whispered. "I already said yes when I stayed." "But I want to," Daniel said, smiling through his emotion. "Will you marry me, Eleanor Pierce? Not because of who you were, but because of who you are here." She nodded, unable to speak, and leaned into him, the snow falling gently around them like a blessing. Spring came early that year, teasing the valley with crocus blooms and thawed fields by March. They married in the orchard beneath white blossoms, the whole town gathering with hand-picked bouquets and potluck dishes. Lena stood as maid of honor, and the vows were written on recycled seed paper. Afterward, Daniel's cousin played fiddle while kids danced barefoot in the grass. There was no press, no headlines, just the sound of love that had worked for every inch of ground it now stood on. Later, as the sun dipped low, Daniel and Eleanor walked back to the farmhouse hand in hand. "I used to think love had to come grand and fast," Eleanor said. "Like the world I came from. Loud, urgent, public." "And now?" Daniel asked. "Now I know it's the slow things that last," she said. "The roots you plant deep, the hand you hold through every season." Daniel stopped her under the same tree where he'd proposed and drew her into a quiet kiss. "Welcome home, Eleanor Whitaker," he said softly. And for the first time in her life she felt no need to run. Morning in Willow Ridge broke softly, as it always did, with mist trailing across the fields like a shawl of memory and promise. The roosters crowed late, as if honoring the quiet reverence of the day. In the kitchen of the farmhouse, Eleanor stood barefoot on the worn wood floors, turning the worn gold ring Daniel had given her the night before between her fingers. It wasn't flashy or new. It was the kind of ring that had weathered decades, like the land itself, thin at the band, slightly warped, etched with life. A promise not just to her, but to everything Willow Ridge stood for. Behind her, Daniel approached, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one in each hand. "You look like that ring is whispering secrets," he said with a half-smile. "It is," she replied, her voice soft. Stories of storms weathered and hands that never let go. They drank their coffee on the porch, listening to the land wake up. Around them, the cooperative they'd started was slowly taking root, literally and figuratively. Barns once falling apart were now restored by shared hands. The old grain silo had become a communal seed bank. Every week, farmers gathered around picnic tables in the old canning shed to discuss everything from crop rotation to digital soil monitors Eleanor had introduced. But it was harvest time now, and that meant hands in the dirt, sun on shoulders, and calluses earned, not inherited. Daniel glanced at the calendar Eleanor had made. Hand-drawn squares, scribbled notes in 3 different pens, and a doodle of a chicken named Gertrude in the corner. "Ready to make it through your first harvest?" he asked, teasing. Eleanor nodded, her expression turning serious. "This time last year I was in a Manhattan boardroom fighting over stock percentages. Now I'm praying for cloud cover and steady hands." Daniel laughed, but he reached for her fingers and gave them a squeeze. "You've already proved you belong here. The land knows it, and so do the people." The days that followed were filled with a kind of exhaustion that felt good in the bones. Eleanor, alongside Daniel, Lena, and the whole cooperative, harvested rows of heirloom corn and dry beans, sun-warmed tomatoes, and late strawberries. There was music on the radio from an old pickup parked in the shade, jars of sweet tea shared from hand to hand, and the occasional good-natured argument over the best way to bundle kale. Eleanor became known for her precision. She weighed every crate, kept mental tallies that amazed even the oldest farmers. But she also knew when to stop and kneel beside a child who wanted to help, or laugh with Lena over a bucket of squash blossoms that had somehow become hats for the farm dogs. At night, she and Daniel would return home aching and content. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just sat on the porch swing watching the stars come out. A slow ballet of time. It was during one of those quiet nights that Daniel turned to her, his voice almost hesitant. "My mother used to say harvest wasn't just about pulling food from the earth. It was about seeing what survived." Eleanor looked at him, her hand over the ring on her finger. "And we survived," she whispered. "But change, even welcome change, brings tension." One evening, after a cooperative meeting, Lena pulled Eleanor aside. "You are making everything better," she began. "But some folks are scared. They see solar panels and computer monitors and think, maybe the soul of this place is being replaced." Eleanor didn't flinch. She had expected this. "Then I'll show them it's not," she said. "We're not replacing the soul. We're nourishing it." "So," she proposed an idea, "the harvest circle. One evening a week, everyone would gather around the bonfire behind the barn. No agendas, just stories. Elders shared tales of dust bowls and miracles. Teens talked about dreams of staying in Willow Ridge instead of fleeing to cities. Children sang songs taught to them by their grandparents. And Eleanor? She shared stories, too, of her mother's loneliness, trapped in a mansion full of mirrors. Of the time she almost signed her future away in a merger with a man she didn't love. Of the first moment Daniel handed her a broken carburetor and said, "Let's fix it." Slowly, the skepticism faded. Not because she had proved her worth with technology, but because she'd become part of the story. Then came the flood. Late October rains fell harder and longer than any could remember. The creek that bordered the east field breached its banks. A night that started with quiet thunder ended in chaos. Fields drowned, fences torn from the earth, the seed bank buildings, lower level swamped. Daniel and Eleanor were the first out in the storm, barefoot, soaked, pulling animals from rising water. Lena arrived with her truck and a crew of volunteers, headlights slicing through rain. The cooperative, every member showed up, shoulder to shoulder, bailing water, salvaging equipment, moving crates of saved heirloom seeds to higher ground. In the early hours, exhausted and soaked through, Daniel stood beside Eleanor beneath the eaves of the barn. "You should have run back to your world when all this started," he said, voice low. She looked at him, mud streaked across her cheek, hair plastered to her scalp, hands scraped. "This is my world," she said, "and I don't run anymore." He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with deep understanding, the kind that didn't need fireworks to burn brightly. Weeks passed. The land recovered, scarred but not broken. Eleanor led an effort to secure grant funding to build a more resilient floodplain system, drawing from both government programs and quiet calls to contacts who remembered her not as the runaway CEO, but as someone who had once helped turn tech into hope. Meanwhile, Daniel began drawing up plans to convert one of the outbuildings into a community schoolroom, somewhere children could learn both algebra and how to mend a fence, code a weather app, and recognize a thunderhead's warning signs. One crisp evening in November, the first frost glittering underfoot, Eleanor stood beside Daniel in the barn, watching as Lena and a handful of local teens tested the new weather monitoring system I'd installed. Daniel leaned toward her and whispered, "You know what you've done here?" Eleanor turned to him. "Tell me, you didn't just save a farm. You gave people a reason to stay." She blinked, tears not of sadness, but of fullness. "And you gave me something to come home to," she replied. The next spring, under the blooming apple trees near the edge of the farm, the cooperative hosted a celebration. There were pies on every table, wildflowers braided into hair, and fiddles playing as couples danced barefoot on the grass. Eleanor stood beside Daniel, her hand in his. No titles, no hidden names, just two people who had weathered storms, harvested truth, and chosen each other. When he pulled her toward the dance floor, she laughed, unrestrained and free. And as they spun slowly, the gold ring on her finger caught the sunlight just so. It gleamed like a new beginning, a life measured in love, not titles. A year had passed since Eleanor Pierce and Daniel Whitaker signed the cooperative charter that transformed Willow Ridge into a sanctuary of purpose, a place where the soil remembered history and the future bloomed in every furrowed row. The town had changed, subtly but unmistakably. The old general store now shared its shelves with sustainable farming tools and biodegradable seed packets. The library hosted weekly forums where eighth-generation farmers and freshly graduated agri-tech students exchanged notes over homemade pie. At the center of it all stood Willow Ridge Farm, a quiet but commanding testament to the power of transformation. On a sun-drenched morning, Eleanor stood at the edge of the orchard, one hand on her hip and the other shading her eyes. Apple blossoms drifted around her like a memory. The wind played with the loose ends of her braid. She had long since abandoned her sleek corporate bob, and her jeans bore honest smudges of dirt and sap. She turned at the sound of footsteps on gravel. Daniel approached, sleeves rolled, straw hat tilted slightly, his smile already familiar to her in a way that went deeper than recognition. "You've been out here a while," he said, handing her a tin mug of sweetened tea. "Lost in another business strategy," she chuckled, taking the tea. "Trying to decide whether we plant crimson clover as a cover crop in the Westfield." I think it'll fix the nitrogen and keep the soil loose. Daniel leaned against the nearby fence post. I remember a time when you didn't know the difference between a disc harrow and a combine, and you used to think crop rotation was just a city buzzword. They grinned, each seeing not just the other's face, but the seasons etched into them. But the truth was, Eleanor still sometimes felt like she was walking a bridge strung between two worlds. The world she came from, built on stock options and quarterly reports, and the world she had found, where wisdom was handed down through calloused hands and quiet Sunday meals. She had chosen this world, undoubtedly, but she never forgot the gravity of what she had left behind, and the strength it took to keep it from creeping back in. Later that evening, after the town's spring festival wound down, and the laughter of children had faded into firefly-lit silence, Eleanor sat on the porch with Daniel, her bare feet propped on the railing. "Do you think they really accept me?" she asked, eyes on the stars. "Or are they just glad I'm not my father?" Daniel considered. "They didn't accept you because of your last name. They accepted you because you stayed when you didn't have to. You tilled soil. You tilled soil. You fixed the irrigation system with your own two hands. You made Lena laugh again. That last one still made her heart ache in the best way. She and I are meeting at the cafe tomorrow. I think she might want to volunteer at the new agri-tech greenhouse." Daniel smiled, pride softening the deep lines of his face. "She's come around." Eleanor sipped her tea. "She's wise beyond her years, like someone else I know." He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "You're still the only CEO I know who keeps a rooster as an alarm clock." They fell into a quiet rhythm, the way only two people who had built trust slowly, day by day, could. The soft ticking of Daniel's father's watch, the one he'd given her when they expanded the co-op to neighboring counties, marked the passage of time between them. The next morning brought a letter, official and crisp, from a tech giant that had once rivaled Eleanor's former firm. They wanted to partner, not in a hostile takeover, but to learn, to replicate what Willow Ridge had achieved. She laid the letter down next to the community ledger, heart pounding, not from ambition, but from a strange, tender awe. What they'd grown here wasn't just working. It was blooming beyond the fences. Daniel came in from morning chores, boots dusty, hands rough, eyes warm. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, sliding a small, worn velvet box onto the table. Eleanor's breath caught. "I didn't want to propose until I was sure you knew what you were saying yes to. Not just me, but this life, the land, the balance between tradition and innovation, the choice to be grounded in something that doesn't need quarterly reports to be meaningful." She opened the box to find a simple gold band, his grandmother's, refitted with care. Her eyes filled. "I've known since that first storm," she whispered. "When you handed me a towel instead of judgment." He took her hand. So the ceremony was small. Neighbors, Lena, friends from the co-op, and Eleanor's closest mentor from the old world, who cried when she saw the rows of crops Eleanor had helped plant. The wedding cake was made by Mrs. Carmichael from the cafe, layered with apples and honey from the local hives. Lena played a soft fiddle tune as Eleanor and Daniel danced their first waltz across the dirt-packed barn floor. Later that night they sat together again on the porch. The stars, ever faithful, blinked above. "You know," Eleanor said, "this isn't the life I ever imagined." Daniel laced his fingers through hers. "That makes two of us. But it's the life I want. You built it. We both did." They watched the wind move through the fields, touching every corner of the land they had worked and loved into something lasting. And as the moon climbed higher, Eleanor Pierce, once a woman known for billion-dollar ideas, rested her head on her husband's shoulder, knowing she had created something greater than any headline, a life measured not by power or prestige, but by love, soil, and truth that grew deeper with every season. The first frost of October came quietly to Willow Ridge, brushing the pumpkin vines with silver and scattering gold across the apple orchard. The last of the sunflowers bowed their heads as if nodding to a season well-lived. From the kitchen window of the farmhouse, Eleanor Pierce Whitaker stood in her flannel robe, cradling a steaming mug of coffee, watching a world she had once only dreamed of calling home. The ring on her finger, the one Daniel's grandmother had worn for 52 years, glinted softly in the morning light. It still surprised her sometimes, not because of the commitment, but because of how right it all felt. As if she had stepped into the truest version of herself the day she'd walked barefoot down the aisle of wildflowers and straw bales. Behind her, Daniel's footsteps crossed the creaking floor. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Cold out there," he murmured. "But beautiful," she whispered back. They stood in the quiet for a while, watching as Lena and a few of the younger farmhands stacked bales of hay in the distance. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding, but the rhythm of life hadn't slowed. It had only grown deeper, richer. Eleanor had taken to mornings on the farm like her soul had remembered something her body had forgotten. She still checked her inbox over breakfast, still read tech reports with her granola. But now she also tended goats with Daniel, helped Lena update the crop software they'd co-developed, and spent her afternoons mentoring local students at the new Willow Ridge Learning Barn, a cozy mix of classroom and greenhouse that had become the valley's proudest addition. Every week, visitors came from across the country to see what had once been an overlooked corner of Montana. They didn't come for luxury. They came for clarity, for connection. They came because Willow Ridge had become proof that innovation could grow in the same soil as tradition. And people listened, not just because Eleanor Pierce had been a tech mogul, but because she now had calluses on her hands and dirt beneath her nails. That afternoon they hosted their first official harvest exchange, a seasonal event where neighbors brought what they'd grown, made, or built, and traded freely. Eleanor stood beside a table of heirloom tomatoes and local honey, greeting people with a warmth she used to reserve for boardroom victories. "Claire from Seattle," said one older farmer, a twinkle in his eye. "Never thought I'd see you hauling squash." Eleanor laughed. "Turns out it's a transferable skill." Nearby, Daniel played fiddle while a young girl sang, her voice carrying across the valley. Children danced. Elders told stories beneath the cottonwoods, and Sarah, the local cafe owner, handed out slices of her famous huckleberry pie with the kind of pride that didn't need an audience. Later, as twilight painted the sky, Daniel found Eleanor sitting beneath the old apple tree at the edge of the orchard, the very spot where they'd first spoken honestly about their pasts. "Thinking?" he asked, handing her a blanket. "Remembering," she said, wrapping it around her shoulders. "The way people lean on each other here." Daniel's hand found hers. "We don't keep it," he said. "We pass it on." And they were. Earlier that week, the Whitaker Pierce Fellowship launched its pilot program, sending 3 students from underserved urban schools to intern at Willow Ridge for the season. The plan was simple. Teach them how to grow things, fix things, build things, and in doing so perhaps repair a little of the world. One of those students, a boy named Malak, had already started showing a real knack for soil mapping. "He reminds me of someone," Eleanor had told Daniel. "Someone who once believed data could change the world." Daniel had smiled. "Maybe now you believe it still can. Just needs a little compost and sunshine." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. Eleanor leaned her head against Daniel's shoulder. "Do you miss how it used to be?" "Before all this," he chuckled. "Before I had to learn what machine learning meant. No, before me. Daniel was quiet, the way he always was when thinking. I miss simpler problems. I don't miss simpler days. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and together they watched the stars appear one by one. No headlines, no contracts, just the honest ticking of time. Later that night, Eleanor wrote a letter. She didn't send it. It wasn't for that. It was for herself. October 12th, Willow Ridge Farm. Dear past me, you thought you were running away. You thought you were escaping pressure, expectation, control. And maybe you were. But what you didn't know was that you were also running toward something. Toward roots, toward truth. Toward a life with fingerprints, not facades. There's a man here who sees me even when I forget who I am. There's a daughter who challenges me with eyes full of fire and hope. And there's a farm that asks for nothing but honesty and offers everything in return. You left a world of glass towers and invisible walls. I hope you know you were brave. Because the life we've built here, it didn't come with guarantees. It came with dirt and sweat and fear, but also with grace. Hold on wherever you are. The road home might be winding, but it's worth every step. With love, Eleanor. She folded the letter and tucked it into the old recipe box Daniel's mother had given her. It sat on the windowsill now, filled with notes, dreams, and recipes passed down through generations. Handwritten reminders that the best things in life aren't scalable. As she turned off the light and climbed into bed beside Daniel, he stirred and reached for her hand. The simple act, repeated night after night, made her heart flutter like it was the first time. Outside, the first snowflake of the season drifted past the window, catching the moonlight like a whispered promise. Now it was the home she'd chosen, again and again, with love, with purpose, with the quiet courage of planting something real and letting it grow. Before we go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Are you tuning in from the heartland of America, a quiet countryside, or maybe a bustling city, dreaming of open fields? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or simply gave you a moment of warmth in your day, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another uplifting story like this. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.